Interior, private lounge, night. The air is heavy with the scent of expensive tobacco and the sharp, metallic tang of cold sweat. Choi Tae-joon, 30s, lethal, impeccable, stares at a digital ledger. The blue light reflects in his eyes, showing a downward crimson spike. Elder Han, CFO, trembles as he points to the screen. It's a siphon, boss. Someone is breathing our air before we can even intake it. Captain Do and Jin Wook stand like statues. Their guns are useless here. Tae-joon feels a presence. He looks up. Alisa Vance stands there. She is a delivery girl in a sharp black uniform, holding a tray of whiskeys. Her face is a mask of professional neutrality, but her eyes are locked on the ledger. She isn't looking at the Mafia boss, she's looking at his failure. Tae-joon lets out a dry, dangerous laugh. It's the laugh of a man who wants to hurt something because he can't fix himself. "What's the matter, sweetheart?" Tae-joon sneers, gesturing to the multi-million-dollar disaster. "Do you have a better way to hide $50 million, or are you just here for the tip?" The room freezes. The insult hangs in the air. Alisa sets the tray down. No rattle, no hesitation. She meets his gaze, not as a servant, but as an equal. "You're using a linear encryption for a multi-nodal problem. No wonder they're finding the trail."
The digital ledger on the mahogany table didn't just show a deficit, it pulsed with the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a dying empire. Choi Tae-joon leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking in a room that had suddenly become too small for the men inside it. He was 32, the youngest head the syndicate had ever known, and he had spent his tenure cultivating an aura of absolute invincibility. But as he stared at the crimson spikes on the screen, he felt the cold, familiar shadow of a different kind of ghost. "Give it to me straight, Elder Han," Tae-joon said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. "No metaphors, no corporate padding." Elder Han, a man who had survived the brutal street wars of the 90s and the subsequent purges that followed, looked uncharacteristically fragile. He adjusted his glasses with a trembling hand, his finger hovering over a line of data that shouldn't have existed. "The bleed started 3 months ago, boss. At first, it looked like standard overhead fluctuations, the cost of doing business in a digital age, but it's accelerating." He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the oppressive silence of the private suite. "Based on this trajectory, our liquidity will hit zero in exactly 90 days. By the end of the quarter, we won't even have the capital to pay the security details at the docks." Beside him, Captain Doe's hand instinctively tightened over the grip of the weapon concealed beneath his tailored suit jacket. He was a man of action, a shield for the Choi name, but he looked lost. "Who is hitting us?" Doe growled. "Is it the Seoul faction? The Russians?" "That's the problem, Captain," Jin Wook, the operations manager, interjected. He paced the perimeter of the room, his eyes darting to the security cameras, as if the threat might materialize from the wiring itself. "There are no footprints, no hostile takeovers, no intercepted shipments. The money is simply retreating. It's as if the financial infrastructure your grandfather built has become a sieve. We are trying to fight a ghost with a knife." Tae-joon didn't look away from the screen. He could handle a war. He knew how to trade blood for territory. But this was an invisible execution. In 90 days, the untouchable Choi Tae-joon would be just another man with a bankrupt legacy, waiting for his rivals to realize his claws had no more weight behind them. The weight of 3 generations pressed down on his shoulders, a crushing pressure that made the air feel thin. He needed a miracle, or at the very least, a perspective that didn't belong to the terrified men surrounding him. He signaled for another round of drinks, his mind spinning toward a dark, desperate edge, unaware that the solution was currently walking toward the table with a tray held in a steady, unbreakable grip.
Black uniform making her nearly invisible against the shadows of the room until she reached the pool of light at the table. She began to set the whiskeys down. As she leaned in to place a glass near Tae-joon, her eyes lingered on the laptop screen for a fraction of a second too long. It wasn't a look of curiosity, it was a look of instinctive correction, the way an artist might flinch at a crooked line. Tae-joon caught it. He felt a surge of irrational, defensive heat. Here was a woman who spent her nights carrying ice and amber liquid, yet she looked at his empire's collapse as if it were a simple typo. He leaned back, a cruel, mocking smile touching his lips. "Something caught your eye, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice dripping with a condescending charm that made Elder Hans stiffen. "Is the data too bright for you, or are you just admiring the scale of a problem you'll never have to solve?" Captain Doe shifted, a silent warning, but Alisa didn't pull away. She stood upright, the empty tray held against her hip, her expression as unreadable as a polished stone. "I was just wondering," she said, her voice a calm, melodic contrast to the gravelly tension in the room, "if you've accounted for the latency in your offshore nodes, or if you enjoy watching 3% of your liquidity vanish into transaction slippage every 6 hours. The room went tomb quiet. Jin-wook's hand froze halfway to his mouth. Tae-joon's smile didn't fade, but it sharpened into something more dangerous. He gestured to the chair opposite him, the seat reserved for kings and ghosts. "By all means," Tae-joon invited, his tone a lethal dare. "Give me the delivery girl's perspective. Tell me how I'm losing $50 million as a joke." Alisa didn't take the chair, but she stepped closer, her shadow falling over the ledger. "It's not a joke, it's math. You're running a legacy laundering operation on a linear encryption backbone. Your enemies aren't hacking you, they're front-running you. Every time you move capital through these 3 shells," she pointed a slim, steady finger at the screen, "you're signaling your intent to the high-frequency algorithms monitoring the chain. You aren't being robbed, you're being out-traded by a ghost in the machine that saw you coming 10 miles away." She spoke for exactly 2 minutes, deconstructing the Choi family's financial soul with the clinical precision of a surgeon. When she finished, she simply picked up her tray. Tae-joon stared at her, the mocking laugh dead in his throat, realizing that the most dangerous person in the room wasn't the man with the gun, but the woman with the tray.
The air in the private suite remained charged long after Alisa had vanished back into the corridors of the lounge. Tae-joon didn't touch his drink. He stared at the empty space where she had stood, her words about multinodal problems and transaction slippage echoing against the digital ruin on his screen. The men around him were silent, nursing a bruised ego they hadn't known they possessed. "Jin-wook," Tae-joon said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "I want her life, every scrap of it. School records, bank statements, the names of her primary school teachers. I want to know why a woman who speaks in high-frequency trading algorithms is carrying a tray in a place like this." The investigation took less than 6 hours. Jin-wook returned just as the sun began to bleed over the city skyline, placing a slim, physical folder on Tae-joon's desk. In a world of digital shadows, the weight of paper felt more honest. Tae-joon flipped it open. The face staring back from the ID photo was younger, her hair looser, but the eyes were the same, observational, evaluative, and entirely unimpressed. "Alisa Vance," Jin-wook began, his voice tight. "She didn't just study economics, she was a prodigy. Full scholarship to the University of Chicago, followed by a fast track into a top-tier quantitative hedge fund in Manhattan. They called her the architect of their most successful arbitrage model." Tae-joon traced the edge of the photo. "And why is an architect serving scotch in Seattle?"
A fall from grace, Jinwook explained. 3 years ago, her firm was hit with a federal investigation into a series of illicit trades that nearly collapsed a mid-sized bank. The evidence was surgical. It pointed directly to her terminal. The firm cut her loose, the industry blacklisted her, and the legal fees from the ensuing trial stripped her of every cent she'd earned. She escaped prison on a technicality, but her reputation was incinerated. Tae-joon read between the lines of the court transcripts. The illicit trades were too clumsy for a woman who could spot a multinodal encryption leak in a glance. It was a classic corporate sacrifice. She hadn't been the criminal. She had been the scapegoat for a CEO who didn't want to trade his penthouse for a cell. She took the fall for men who weren't half as smart as she is, Tae-joon murmured, a dark spark of kinship igniting in his chest. He realized then that they were the same. He was trapped by the outdated legacy of his father's empire, and she was trapped by the wreckage of a world that had betrayed her. She wasn't a plant, and she wasn't a joke. She was a weapon that had been discarded, and Choi Tae-joon had always been an expert in finding the utility in things others threw away. He closed the folder. "Captain Doe, get the car. I think it's time we offer Miss Vance a much larger tip."
The neighborhood was a collection of faded brick walk-ups and flickering street lamps, a place where people lived when they were trying to be forgotten. Tae-joon stood on the cracked sidewalk, his tailored charcoal overcoat looking like a visual error against the grit of the surroundings. Behind him, the idling black sedan and Captain Doe's silent, watchful presence drew the nervous curtains of a dozen windows. Tae-joon climbed the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor, the scent of stale rain and old timber clinging to the walls. He stopped at 3B and knocked, not the aggressive bang of a debt collector, but a steady, measured cadence. When the door opened, Alisa didn't look surprised. She was no longer in her service uniform. She wore a simple gray sweater and leggings, her hair loose. She didn't invite him in, but she didn't close the door either. Her gaze flicked to the shadow of Captain Doe at the end of the hallway, then back to Tae-joon. "I don't serve drinks at home, Mr. Choi," she said, her voice cool and level. "And I didn't come for a drink, Miss Vance," he replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, heavy vellum envelope. He didn't hand it to her. He held it between them like a bridge. "I spent the morning reading about New York, about the architect who was buried under the debris of a firm that didn't deserve her." For the first time, a flicker of something human, pain perhaps, traversed her neutral expression. "If you're here to blackmail a waitress, you're overqualified for the job." "I'm here because I'm dying," Tae-joon said, and the honesty of it seemed to catch her off guard. "Not by a bullet, but by the same math you described last night. My family's legacy is bleeding out, and the men I pay to stop it are still trying to use tourniquets on a digital ghost." He finally extended the envelope. Inside is a contract. It offers a salary that will pay off your remaining legal debts in 6 months. It offers a secure server, a private office, and my personal protection. In return, I want you to rebuild the Choi infrastructure from the bedrock up." Alisa looked at the envelope but didn't take it. "And the fine print? Working for a man like you isn't a career move, Mr. Choi. It's an initiation." "The fine print is simple." Tae-joon stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, intense frequency. "You become the brain of my organization. You will see things no one else sees. That makes you the most powerful person in my circle and the most dangerous liability if you ever decide to leave. It is a lifeline, Alisa, but it is also a cage." He placed the envelope in her hand. Her fingers brushed his, a brief electric contact of 2 people who had both been burned by the worlds they tried to build. "You have until dawn," he said, turning toward the stairs. "Don't be late for your shift.
Either way, your life as a waitress ended the moment you spoke that sentence last night.
The transition from the walk-up apartment to the glass and steel nerve center of the Choi syndicate was a journey between two different deaths, and Alisa Vance knew it. She arrived at dawn, her silhouette sharp against the rising sun, stepping into a world that operated on the binary of loyalty and lethality. While Tae-joon's offer had been a lifeline, the reception within the inner sanctum was a cold, unsheathed blade. Jin-wook was waiting for her in the sleek subterranean corridor leading to the server rooms. He stood with his arms crossed, his designer suit perfectly pressed, but his eyes were filled with the ancient territorial heat of a man who saw his influence being diluted. As Alisa approached, he didn't move to let her pass. He anchored himself in the center of the hallway, a physical roadblock in a world of digital paths. "The boss has a weakness for strays," Jin-wook said, his voice a low sandpaper rasp that echoed off the polished walls. "He thinks because you can speak the language of the tickers, you're an asset, but I see a liability. I see a woman who was broken by a courtroom in New York and is looking for a place to hide her head." Alisa stopped exactly 3 feet from him. She didn't look at his hands or his waistline where the holster sat. She looked directly into his pupils. "If I wanted to hide, Jin-wook, I would have stayed at the lounge. It's much easier to disappear when people only see you as a tray and a uniform." Jin-wook stepped closer, entering her personal space with a calculated, predatory slow motion. He leaned down, his breath smelling of bitter espresso. "You're an outsider. You aren't Choi blood, and you aren't street bred. You're a ghost in a machine we've spent 30 years building. If a single decimal point is out of place, if $1 goes missing under your new architecture, I won't wait for Tae-joon's permission. I'll handle the security risk myself." The threat was explicit, a heavy weight meant to crush her resolve before she even touched a keyboard. He was the snake in this new garden, guarding the old ways with a venomous tenacity. Alisa felt the familiar coldness of the Chicago trading floors, the same masculine posturing, the same desperate need for gatekeeping. It was a language she spoke better than he did. "You're afraid," she said, her voice dropping to a calm, terrifyingly flat tone. "You're afraid that when I plug the leaks, I'll find out that some of that evaporating money was actually being guided into your pockets. You aren't worried about the family's security, Jin-wook. You're worried about your own." The color drained from Jin-wook's face, replaced by a mottled, dangerous flush. His hand twitched toward his jacket, but Alisa didn't flinch. She simply stepped around him, her shoulder brushing his in a silent declaration of war. "I have a 90-day deadline," she threw back over her shoulder without stopping. "Unless you'd like to explain to Tae-joon why you're wasting my first hour on a monologue, I suggest you get out of my way." The server room was a cathedral of cold air and blinking blue light, a sharp contrast to the smoke-filled back rooms where the Choi family usually conducted their business. Alisa sat at the center of the console, her fingers moving with a rhythmic, percussive speed that seemed to mimic the heartbeat of the building itself. Beside her, Elder Han watched the monitors with a mixture of awe and deep-seated suspicion. "These ghost protocols?" Han muttered, leaning in to squint at the cascading lines of code. "They don't show the origin of the transfers. If I can't see where the money is coming from, how do I know it's ours?" Alisa didn't look up. "That's the point, Elder Han. If you can see the origin, so can the federal auditors and the rival syndicates currently skimming your accounts. My system uses a rolling obfuscation. The money doesn't stay in one place long enough to be identified. It exists in the gaps between transactions." With a final, decisive keystroke, she initiated the first audit. On the wall-sized master display, the old, crumbling financial map of the Choi Empire began to dissolve. It was replaced by a fluid, shimmering web of data. "As of this second," Alisa said, her voice echoing in the sterile room, "every old guard method is offline. No more cash-heavy deposits at the docks. No more static shell companies. If your men want to move capital, they have to use the encrypted hardware wallets I've distributed. Every cent is now tethered to a biometric signature." The door hissed open, and Captain Doe stepped in, holding one of the small, sleek devices as if it were a live grenade. "The captains at the harbor are furious," he reported, looking at Tae-joon, who stood in the shadows of the doorway. "They say they aren't tech experts. They want to go back to the ledgers. They don't trust a box they can't read." Tae-joon stepped into the light, his eyes fixed on the new map Alisa had created. He saw the bleeding red lines of the previous weeks beginning to stabilize, turning into a steady, neutral gray. "They don't need to trust the box. They need to trust me. And I trust the woman who just saved us $4 million in the last 20 minutes. Alisa pointed to a specific node on the screen that was pulsing, a deep, angry violet. "The stabilization is working, but there's a friction point. Someone is trying to bypass the biometric lock from an internal terminal." The room went cold. This was the first test of the new architecture. It wasn't just a financial tool, it was a digital trap. By forcing the old guard to change their ways, Alisa hadn't just plugged the leaks, she had flushed the saboteurs into the light. "Trace it," Tae-joon commanded, his hand resting on the back of Alisa's chair. "I already have," she replied, her gaze meeting his in the reflection of the glass. "It's coming from the operations floor, specifically Jin Wook's private terminal."
The violet pulse on the screen was more than a technical glitch. It was a confession. Alisa leaned into the monitor, her face illuminated by the cold light of the data stream. While the men in the room grew restless, she operated with a predatory focus, her fingers dancing across the keys to strip away the layers of the unauthorized intrusion. "He's not just trying to bypass the lock," Alisa murmured, her voice cutting through the hum of the cooling fans. "He's trying to trigger a recursive wipe. If this script completes, the entire ledger won't just disappear. It will look like a catastrophic server failure caused by my new protocols." Tae-joon stood behind her, a dark silhouette of brewing violence. "He wants to frame you for the collapse he created." "It's more than that," she replied, pulling up a secondary window that revealed a hidden subroutine buried deep within the old system's architecture. "Look at the routing. This isn't a simple drain. It's a mirrored account. For every dollar that evaporated over the last 3 months, a digital twin was being minted and moved into a private liquidity pool. He wasn't just stealing your money, Mr. Choi. He was building a rival treasury using your own blood." She isolated the source code of the siphon. It wasn't the work of a distant hacker or a rival syndicate. The code was signed with an administrative override key that only one person possessed. "The ghost has a name," Alisa said, turning the monitor so Tae-joon could see the final trace. "The sabotage was initiated using the Jin Wook's credentials, but the actual execution was scheduled weeks ago. He didn't just stumble into your meeting at the lounge. He was waiting for the clock to run out so he could step into the vacuum you left behind." Captain Doe's jaw tightened, his hand moving to the heavy silence of the weapon at his side. The air in the room became suffocatingly thin. They weren't just looking at a financial leak anymore. They were looking at a coup d'etat written in C++. "He thinks he's playing a game of shadows," Alisa said, her eyes locking on to Tae-joon's. "But he forgot that shadows can't exist without a light to define them. I've frozen the liquidity pool. The money is sitting in a digital purgatory that only I can unlock. He's currently staring at a screen that tells him he's a billionaire, but the moment he tries to move a single cent, a silent alarm will trigger a location pinger." Tae-joon looked at the screen, then back at the woman he had found carrying a tray. A slow, lethal smile spread across his face, the look of a man who had finally found a partner who understood that the most effective trap wasn't a cage, but a mirror. "Let him try to move it," Tae-joon whispered. "I want to see the exact moment he realizes he's already dead."
The move against the Choi family didn't come in the form of a subpoena or a bank freeze. It came with the screech of tires and the percussion of shattering glass. They were transitioning Alisa to a secondary secure location when the first black SUV jumped the curb, intentionally ramming the lead car in their small convoy. The impact sent a shudder through the armored sedan where Alisa sat between Captain Do and the window. Before the smoke had even cleared from the collision, the air was filled with the rhythmic, terrifying stutter of automatic gunfire. "Get down!" Do roared, his massive hand slamming onto Alisa's shoulder and forcing her toward the floorboards. Alisa didn't scream. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but the analytical chill that had served her on the trading floors didn't desert her. She curled into a ball, smelling the acrid scent of gunpowder and the hot iron of the car's engine. This was the physical manifestation of the war she had been fighting on a screen, the old world trying to reclaim the silence she had broken. The car door was ripped open, but it wasn't a rival. It was Captain Do, his face a mask of lethal focus. He dragged her out into the chaos of the alleyway, using his own body as a human shield. Bullets sparked off the brickwork above them. Do fired back with a steady, surgical precision, his movements a blur of practiced violence. "Run! Toward the service entrance," Do commanded, pushing her toward a heavy steel door as two more gunmen emerged from the shadows. For a moment, Alisa saw the world as a series of trajectories. She saw the angle of the attackers, the lack of cover, and the staggering weight of the man protecting her. Captain Do took a hit to the shoulder, a wet thud that made him grunt, but he didn't waver. He stepped directly into the line of fire, shielding her from a spray of glass as a nearby window disintegrated. In that moment, the dynamic shifted. Captain Do, who had spent decades valuing only those who could bleed for the Choi name, realized he wasn't just protecting a woman or a guest. He was protecting the only person who could stop their world from turning into a graveyard. If Alisa died, the codes died with her, and the family's assets would be locked in the digital purgatory she had created, forever out of reach of the traitors and the loyalists alike. He threw her through the steel door just as Jin Wook's reinforcements arrived, but the look he gave her wasn't of annoyance. It was a look of grim acknowledgement. "Stay behind the concrete," Do barked, his voice strained as blood soaked through his charcoal suit. "You're the only one who can win this war, Architect. Don't you dare stop breathing."
The reinforced steel door slammed shut, cutting off the deafening roar of the ambush, but the silence inside the secondary bunker was just as heavy. Alisa didn't wait for the adrenaline to fade. She sprinted toward the terminal at the center of the room, her boots echoing against the concrete floor. Outside, the muffled thuds of suppressed gunfire told her Captain Do was buying her every second with his own life. She threw herself into the chair and slammed her palms against the console. The screens flickered to life, bathing her face in a cold electric glow. "Come on," she whispered, her fingers flying across the keys. She wasn't looking at the security cameras. She was looking at the code. The moment the physical attack began, the digital assault had reached a fever pitch. A rival hacker, someone fast, expensive, and ruthless, was trying to tear through her ghost protocols while the family was distracted by the lead.
"You're good," Alisa muttered, watching a cascade of red command lines attempt to brute force her biometric gates. "But you're arrogant." The rival was using a classic DDoS attack as a smokescreen, trying to overwhelm the servers so they could slip a Trojan into the main treasury. Alisa saw the pattern immediately. It was the same aggressive, high-risk strategy she had seen back in New York. She didn't retreat, she pivoted. Instead of building a wall, she opened a trap door. She wrote a recursive loop on the fly, a piece of digital architecture designed to mirror the hacker's own signature back at them. As they poured more power into the breach, they were actually fueling the script that would trace their physical location. The screen split. On the left, the Choi family assets were being pulled into a decentralized vault, moving so fast they became a blur of unreadable data. On the right, she was deconstructing the rival's identity. She saw the routing jumps: Moscow, Berlin, then a high-speed hub in downtown Seattle, less than 6 blocks away. "I have you," she breathed. The rival realized the trap too late. They tried to sever the connection, but Alisa had already locked the handshake. She initiated a black hole protocol, a scorched earth line of code that didn't just stop the hack, it fried the rival's hardware from the inside out. One by one, the red lines on her screen turned to gray, then vanished. The digital war ended in a sudden, jarring silence. The treasury was secure. The ghost had been exorcised. Alisa leaned back, her chest heaving, the blue light reflecting in eyes that no longer looked like those of a waitress. She looked at the location pinger pulsing on the map. She had the coordinates of the person who had tried to kill them all. The door behind her creaked open. Tae-joon stepped in, his overcoat torn and his knuckles bruised, looking every bit the untouchable boss who had just walked through hell. He didn't ask if the money was safe. He looked at her face and saw the victory written in the set of her jaw. "The assets?" he asked. "Safe," she said, her voice steady. "And I know where they're hiding. They thought they were fighting a syndicate. They didn't realize they were fighting an architect."
The adrenaline that had sustained them through the smoke and the digital fire began to recede, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in the bunker. Outside, the sirens of the city wailed in the distance, a reminder that while their war was invisible, its consequences were loud. Inside, the only sound was the steady hum of the servers that Alisa had just saved from annihilation. Tae-joon stood by the reinforced door, his silhouette framed by the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. He looked at his hands. They were stained with carbon and the dust of the alleyway. For the first time in his life, the physical power he wielded felt secondary, almost primitive. He turned to look at Alisa, who was still seated at the console, her fingers resting lightly on the keys as if she were still connected to the pulse of the machines. "I've spent my life believing that control was something you took with force," Tae-joon said, his voice dropping to a low, reflective resonance. He walked toward her, not with the predatory stride of a boss, but with the measured steps of a man standing before a revelation. "I thought a waitress was someone who existed in the background of my life to facilitate my comfort. I was wrong. I wasn't just wrong about you. I was wrong about the world I was trying to lead." Alisa looked up, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in her eyes. The mask of the delivery girl had been discarded long ago, replaced by the sharp, undeniable clarity of the architect. "You didn't know how to see me," she said simply. "Most people don't. They see the uniform, the tray, the color of my skin, and they fill in the blanks with their own assumptions. It's a convenient blind spot." "It nearly cost me everything," Tae-joon admitted, stopping a few feet from her. He leaned against the edge of the desk, his presence no longer an intimidation, but a support. "Why did you do it? You could have let the system crash. You could have taken the keys and disappeared in the chaos." Alisa looked back at the screen, where the tracing pinger was still pulsing over the rival's location. A small, bittersweet smile touched her lips.
"Because I missed the game," she confessed softly. "In New York, they took the board away from me. They told me I wasn't allowed to play anymore. Carrying those trays, it was a slow death, Tae-joon. Last night, when you asked that joke of a question, you gave me the board back. I didn't save your money because I'm loyal to a syndicate. I saved it because I finally found a problem worth solving." Tae-joon watched her, realizing that their alliance wasn't built on a contract or a paycheck, but on a shared hunger for relevance in a world that tried to render them obsolete. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the console. "The game has changed, and I don't want to play it without the person who actually knows the rules." Alisa didn't pull away. She looked at the pinger, then at the man beside her. The untouchable boss and the waitress were gone, replaced by two architects standing in the ruins of an old world, ready to build something far more dangerous.
The summit was held in a neutral glass tower overlooking the harbor, a cold, antiseptic space where the city's underground power brokers met to carve up the remains of the week's chaos. Choi Tae-joon sat at the head of the obsidian table, his expression unreadable, his presence backed by the silent, bandaged silhouette of Captain Do. Across from them sat the architects of the recent ambush, the rival faction leaders and their technical consultants, men who believed they had the Choi family cornered. The tension was a physical weight. The rivals had come to dictate terms of surrender, citing the unstable nature of Tae-joon's current financial standing. They spoke of mergers and takeovers, their voices filled with the smug certainty of predators who thought they had seen the bottom of their opponents' pockets. Alisa stood behind Tae-joon, once again the quiet observer, once again dressed in black. To the man across the table, she was still just a decorative accessory, a token of Tae-joon's supposed decline into eccentricity. "Your infrastructure is a ruin, Tae-joon," the lead rival sneered, sliding a document across the table. "Your accounts are frozen, your ghost protocols are a failure, and you're bleeding liquidity. Sign the transfer, and we'll let you keep your life." Tae-joon didn't look at the paper. He leaned back and glanced at Alisa. The room fell into a mockery of silence, the rivals sharing a derisive laugh at the gesture. "What do you think, Alisa?" Tae-joon asked softly. "Is the data too bright for them?" Alisa stepped forward, not into the light, but into the center of the conversation. She didn't open a laptop. She didn't show a spreadsheet. She simply looked at the rival's lead negotiator, the man who had supposedly hacked her system, and delivered the sentence that brought the entire house of cards down. "You've built your entire leverage on the assumption that I was trying to hide the money from you, but you never asked why I made it so easy for you to find the mirrored account." The negotiator's smile faltered. A small, cold bead of sweat formed on his brow. "The account you think you've seized isn't a vault," Alisa continued, her voice a razor-sharp clinical hum. "It's a recursive loop tethered to the international anti-money laundering triggers of 3 different central banks. By taking it, you just signed your own digital confession." The silence that followed was no longer a joke. It was the sound of an empire's floor falling away. In one sentence, Alisa had flipped the power dynamic. She hadn't used a gun. She had used their own greed to craft a digital noose. The rivals looked at their phones, their faces turning ashen as the first notifications of frozen assets and federal pings began to roll in. Tae-joon stood up, the untouchable aura fully restored, looking at the broken man across the table. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The architect had already spoken.
The glass tower was quiet now, the storm of the negotiation replaced by a calm that felt like victory. In the weeks that followed the summit, the Choi syndicate didn't just recover, it evolved. The old, bloody methods of territorial enforcement remained as a deterrent, but the true power of the family had moved into the digital slipstream. Tae-joon stood on the balcony of his new headquarters, looking out over the city that once thought it could drain him dry. He was still the boss, his name still commanded a silence in the streets, and his word was still law. But when he looked at the intricate, shifting network of the family's new global assets, he knew he was no longer the sole master of his fate. He had become the sword, but he had found his edge in someone else. Inside the office, Alisa Vance sat before a curved array of monitors. There was no tray, no name badge, and no low ponytail. Her hair was down, and she wore a suit that cost more than a year's wages at the Meridian Cafe. She didn't look like a woman who had been rescued. She looked like a woman who had finally claimed the throne she was born for. The city's underworld had a new name for her. They didn't call her the Waitress, and they didn't call her a consultant. They called her the Architect. To the rival families, she was a ghost who could freeze their bank accounts with a keystroke and expose their secrets to the feds before they could even draw a weapon. She was the reason the untouchable boss was now truly beyond reach. The fear she inspired wasn't born of the threat of a bullet, but the certainty of a calculation. Tae-joon stepped back inside and poured 2 glasses of scotch. He set one down on her desk, his eyes catching the reflection of the data streams in her calm, evaluative gaze. "The elder Han wants to know if we should expand into the Singapore nodes," Tae-joon said, his voice a low, respectful murmur. Alisa didn't look away from the screen, her fingers poised over the keys. "Tell Han to wait. I'm currently deconstructing the Singaporean firewall. I'll have an answer for him in 10 minutes. Tae-joon leaned against the desk, watching her work. He realized then that the power dynamic hadn't just flipped, it had stabilized into something unbreakable. He was the force, and she was the direction. Together, they were a closed loop, a multi-nodal solution to a world that was still trying to solve problems with linear violence. The waitress who had spoken one sentence had become the most feared woman in the city, and the boss who had asked a joke had become the architect of a new kind of empire. The ledger was no longer bleeding, it was breathing, and for the first time in 3 generations, the Choi family wasn't just surviving, they were the ones who owned the ghosts.